Sorry.
So, welcome everybody. My name is Jennifer Wolf, and I'm very pleased to be the facilitator here today for our discussion. Come on in, everyone. I am the executive director of a local group called Women Writing for a Change, but we also like men who are writing for a change. And this man is one of those men. And so we're just so pleased to have you here. And this. Now, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Is that better? Again, my name is Jennifer Wolf, and we're here today to hear from Jon Pahl, who's written a very interesting book that I have not yet read. But thankfully, I have a wonderful co-facilitator who has. I'm going to let her introduce herself in a moment. But we have a number of questions to ask, and we are going to ask for your help in asking some questions. So you'll notice that you have a card in front of you. If you would, I'd like you to do two things today. While our author is speaking, Dr. Pahl, if you would be so kind as to write down on one side any question that you might have for him. We'll be asking those questions afterwards. But also, on the other side, just jot down a phrase or a sentence or an idea that he said that really resonated with you, that was important for you to hear tonight. Okay, and we'll read those too. And I'd like to begin, as we usually do in our women writing circles, by reading a poem and a quote. In the circles where we face ourselves, we listen like a miracle. 1,000 years of healing. From whence my hope I cannot say, except it grows in the cells of my skin. In my envelope of mysteries it hums. In this sheet so akin to the surface of the earth, it whispers. Beneath the wail and dissonance of the world, hope's song grows, until I know that with this turning, we put a broken age to rest. We, who are alive at the cusp, now usher in 1,000 years of healing. Winged ones and four-leggeds, grasses and mountains and each tree, all the swimming creatures, even we, wary two-leggeds, hum and call and create the changing song. We remake all our relations. We convert our minds to the earth, and in this turning time, we finally learn to chime and blend, attune our voices, sing the vision of the great magic we move within. We begin the new habit, getting up glad for 1,000 years of healing. And that's 1,000 Years of Healing by Sousa Silva-Marie. I'll introduce I'm first going to introduce my co-facilitator. I'd like her to say her name and what brings her here today.
Hello, my name is Baby Sue. I'm a student at UNF. I personally read his book and I'm interested in what he has to say today. So.
Thank you. Jon Pahl is a historian of American religions and the history of Christianity, a public theologian, and an award-winning teacher, musician, and community activist. He received his bachelor's from Valparaiso University, his master's in theological studies at Trinity Lutheran Seminary, and his PhD from the University of Chicago Divinity School. Dr. Pahl has spoken with audiences at Oxford and Cambridge, Stanford, Yale, Princeton, and many other academic venues around the globe, in addition to his work as a youth minister, lay preacher, administrator, board member, and teacher in many diverse congregations and agency settings. Dr. Pahl has published dozens of articles, essays, columns, and reviews, has appeared on media outlets from the BBC to ABC, and is author or editor of 6 books. Most recently, I love this one, Shopping Malls and Other Sacred Spaces, Putting God in Place, and Empire of Sacrifice, The Religious Origins of American Violence. He works as Minister of Faith Formation and Community Engagement at Union Congregational United Church of Christ in Green Bay, Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, he lives on a lake in Clintonville with his wife of 35 years, enjoys gardening, spends time with his family and friends, and enjoys sitting in on the saxophone with jazz, gospel, and R&B bands. So, may I introduce you to Dr. Jon Pahl. And for our first question, I'll ask it.
Okay.
I'm going to ask a little bit of context questions. The first is, why did you take 10 years of your life to study this particular person and bring this message to the world through your book?
Thank you all for being here tonight. I feel very much at home. I feel like I'm in church. Nobody sits in the front. There are open seats up here, so feel free to move up. I first became acquainted with Fethullah Gülen in 2006 when I was invited to an iftar dinner at the Sheraton Hotel in Philadelphia. I'm on the faculty at the Lutheran Seminary in Philadelphia and have been active in interreligious dialogue for a long time. But I didn't know who the invitation came from. It came from a group called Dialogue Forum. And I wasn't quite sure what an iftar dinner was, but I did know that I liked free food. So I went. And was pleasantly surprised to be in the company of about 200 other academics and public figures, many of whom I recognized. And the keynote speaker that night was Father Thomas Michel, who at the time was the Vatican's chief interreligious officer. And he was really a terrible speaker. Sorry. I say this in print, so now I can repeat it this way as well. But he read to us. He just read to us from a book he himself had not written. I thought, this is weird. But once I got over my judging attitude, I started listening to the words. And he was reading to us from a book by Fethullah Gulen, the man whose biography I have now written. And the title of the book was, for crying out loud, Toward a Global Civilization of Love and Tolerance. And I picked up a copy of the book that night and began reading it and realized that this was an individual in the caliber of the Dalai Lama, of Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., of the Liberian peace builder and Nobel Peace Prize winner Lima Bowie. And that was the inception of what actually 12 years later became this biography. So it was an effort to understand a peace builder, someone who took their faith tradition and intentionally applied it in a way to create a more just and peaceful world. And that was the task of the biography.
So why did you feel it was your job, to do this work?
All of my writing, including the book on shopping malls, has explored the interface between religions and violence, or religions and peace building. And I just wrapped up the book, Empire of Sacrifice, which is about religious violence in the United States. It was a painful book to write because it's difficult to see religions get twisted and diverted. And I had begun research on a book that I'm now working on entitled Becoming Religious Peace, which focuses on the emergence of religious peace building around the globe. The single most important story in the history of religions in the 20th and early 21st century that nobody knows. How religious actors have been involved in peace building. And because I was able to bring this, or draw on that comparative perspective, I was able to realize the significance of Mr. Gülen as a global figure. And I have to admit, after writing that book, I was looking for a happier topic. And at the time, in 2010, when I began the research, Mr. Gülen had been voted more times 100 most influential figures. Things were booming in Turkey. He was in very good stead with the Turkish government. And I thought, okay, well, this will be a happier topic to write. The life story of a man who's a peace builder who's celebrated like Gandhi and so forth. And then, of course, as you perhaps know, probably know, things went very, very far south in Turkey, beginning in 2012. But am I the right person to have written this book? I don't know. It's not the definitive biography. There will be other biographies of this man by people who are more skilled in Turkish. My Turkish is not particularly good. I studied it for a summer and usually can make my way through a conversation or can understand it anyway. But I wrote an essay about my study of Turkish entitled The Güzel Ama Zor Turkish Language, which for those of you who speak Turkish know means the beautiful but difficult Turkish language. So there are other people who could write a good biography of Mr. Gülen, but I'm truly honored and humbled by the challenge. One of the things I discovered in writing it is that it truly is the case that no individual is an island. We're all part of the main. And trying to reduce a life to a single narrative is an exceptionally difficult thing. How do you choose what relationships to highlight? What events to lift up? And I did my best, but I know there are others. And I pray that others will come along who can do better.
So kind of going off of what you just talked about.
A little closer to your face.
Yep.
In your book, you claim that Mr. Gülen is a peace educator and has never been involved in any religious extremism. So why do you think that Turkey has verified him as a scapegoat for the coup attempt against the Erdogan government?
Okay. We're going to jump right into it here.
Give us a little context of how we got to that.
Yeah. So in July 15th, 2016, there was something happened in Turkey that was called a failed coup that appeared to many of us almost immediately to be highly suspicious, and in the opinion of many analysts of Turkey, might very well be a staged event. In other words, a staged coup in order to solidify power by the ruling regime. Mr. Gülen and people associated with him or inspired by him, called people of Hizmet, grew dramatically to public influence in Turkey almost by accident. In other words, to understand Mr. Gülen politically is to misunderstand him. Let me say that one again. If you're going to write down a sentence, this is an important one. To understand Mr. Gülen politically is to misunderstand him. Because he is first and foremost a spiritual leader. First and foremost, a man of prayer, fasting, confession of the oneness of God. He's a Haji. He's made the pilgrimage 3 times. He's encouraged people to practice zakat, charity. In other words, he's a faithful Muslim who also has translated the faith for the modern world, right? And what happened, starting in the 1960s in Turkey when he was serving in Izmir, is that people were drawn to him because of his integrity and because of his ethical grounding and because of his vision. His vision of how Islam is compatible with mundanity and rationality and science. And that combination drew people to him and inspired this now global movement called Hizmet, or community of people called Hizmet, that focuses on 3 things. People of Hizmet, inspired by Mr. Gülen, have done 3 things. They built schools, mostly math and science academies, all over the world, in 130 different countries, out of the conviction that teaching and learning is a sacred vocation. Secondly, people inspired by Mr. Gülen, I'm glad that's not my phone. I've had that happen in talks that I've given where my phone goes off. It might today. We'll see. I hope not.
Turn off your phone.
That's right. Exactly. The second thing people inspired by Mr. Gülen have done is develop social enterprises, that is, generating wealth, not to satisfy short-term greed, but instead to solve social problems. So, social businesses in media and communications, in banking, in other industries that exist, relief agencies, that exist to solve social problems, so social enterprises. Third, people inspired by Mr. Gülen have been encouraged and engaged in interreligious dialogue, like the one we're having tonight. And because people were inspired by Mr. Gülen, and a community emerged, the Jemaat, in Turkey. This was perceived as a threat by political leaders, not only by the current regime, but also by previous regimes in Turkey. And Mr. Gülen is a perfect scapegoat because he won't hit back, because he's an advocate of nonviolence, and because he believes that Islam means to practice positive action, musbet harakat, positive action, not reacting to evil, but consistently, practically, daily, putting one's faith into action on behalf of a more just and peaceful world. So it's truly tragic what has happened in Turkey. And it didn't just begin in 2016. There were a number of efforts early on, beginning in 2012 perhaps, to identify and target people close to Mr. Gülen. But I think the charges that Mr. Gülen was behind the coup are truly, when you start looking at the evidence, ludicrous. He's a victim of previous coups in Turkey. He's a religious leader, not a politician. He doesn't own a computer. He lives in the Poconos in a single-room apartment, right? Just compare the moral gravity of the key individuals involved in this situation. Okay, Mr. Gülen has consistently lived simply and quietly, positively, encouraging people to unite religion and science. The current president of Turkey built for himself an 1,100-room palace. I mean, just look at the evidence in short. And it's, again, tragic what has happened. Sorry, that was a long answer to a really focused and important question.
And definitely be writing down your questions, because we're going to do that in a minute. My question for you is, what can today's Christians learn from you, a Christian professor on Christianity, learn about interfaith dialogue by understanding this man?
Well, I hope that I've become a better Christian through my study of Mr. Gulen and people of Hizmet. I truly do, and I believe that's true. Although you'd have to ask my family and the people who know me better, I suppose. One of my guides, I'm Lutheran by background, I teach at the Lutheran seminary, is Martin Luther, who in his most famous, perhaps, Reformation treatise, Christian Liberty, argued this thesis. A Christian is a perfectly free, Lord of all, subject to none. And a Christian is a perfectly dutiful, servant of all, subject to all. I have understood that paradox better through my study of Mr. Gulen and people of Hizmet. In other words, how we truly are, because God is merciful and compassionate, free. We are truly free to act, to risk, to love. The very first sentences of that book that I heard in 2006, Tom Michel read from, the very first sentences of that book by Mr. Gulen go like this. Love is the most essential element of every being. Love is the most radiant light. Love is the greatest power, able to resist and overcome all else. So, through God's grace and mercy, we are truly free to love. And that means to risk action in service in Hizmet to our neighbor. So that's what I've learned theologically, in part, from my study of Mr. Gulen and the Hizmet movement.
And what would you advise today's Christians to understand about the Muslim faith because of your work?
So the book is written as three aims. The first is to describe his life, Mr. Gulen's life, accurately. The second is to describe the significance of his life through the Hizmet movement, through this movement of individuals dedicated to literacy, social enterprise, and interreligious dialogue. The third aim of the book is to offer an introduction to authentic Islam for non-Muslim readers. That is, for people who might wonder, is Islam really a religion of peace? And I think the answer from the book, I hope, after you read it, will be yes. What do you think?
Happy to ask one more question and then we'll get on. Okay. So now is your opportunity to love audience participation. Just take a moment. Did anybody in here write down an important sentence that they heard that they'd like to share with us?
Don't have this.
Say that again. Oh, you don't have a pencil. Oh, we have pencils. Anybody? Just shout it out. Did you write one?
I didn't write something, but no individual in Ireland connected to movement. And also, while Paul explaining the aim of the book, he highlighted this point by mentioning about Mr. Gülen's life. You are connecting his life, significance of the Hizmet and the movement, and they were completely matched.
And I can't take credit for No One Is an Island. That's John Donne, the English poet.
It's okay. We heard you though. That's the important. Excellent. Thank you. Anybody else would like to share? Yes.
What is in central his life? What is and what do you see?
So this is a question.
Yeah. Go ahead.
The question was, what is at the center of Mr. Gülen's life? He was raised in a very pious family. So his mother, Rafia, was his first Quran teacher, actually, and his father was an imam. So Islam has always been a part of his life. But he was also educated into Sufism. That is the deep spirituality at the core, I believe, of Islam, cutting across both Sunni and Shia branches. And the first principle that Mr. Gulen writes about in his books on key concepts in the practice of Sufism, the very first and the longest entry is on the idea of riza. That is, living for God's pleasure. And it seems to me that this is truly what his life has been committed to, if you want to understand what has motivated him, is that he truly is living for God's pleasure, sought to live for God's pleasure. And of course, what that horizon does, that horizon of eternity, if you will, and infinity, is that again, it frees you to risk. It frees you to listen. And so I think everything that flows from his life and his significance can be found in this core idea of abandoning the ego, getting rid of one's ego, and living instead for God's pleasure. Okay.
You want to collect the,
Could I ask my question?
Yes.
It's too long a question.
yes, go
Like,
ahead.
I'm sorry, we should have another mic so that we can hear, but speak louder.
Yep. Dr. Paul, you stole my first question when you compared him to Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Because I was going to ask him how you compare it. And looking at Mr. Gulen's life and how his message spread, we know that Gandhi and King and others had organizations that enabled the word to go out.
Yep.
How did it happen in Turkey and the other 129 countries?
Yeah. The question was, how did Gandhi and King had organizations that helped communicate their message? Is there a similar organization or pattern in Mr. Gulen's life? Yes, in short. And I take this up in the last chapter. Maybe I should just give a brief overview of the book. There are 5 chapters in the book. And each of the chapters, in addition to following his life chronologically from his origins to his existence in America now, focuses on a theme or topic. So the first chapter is on learning and on education, his commitment to education. The second chapter focuses on the non-violent practices of Islam, for instance, prayer. My conviction is, as Mr. Gulen teaches it, prayer is a practice of non-violence. Third focuses on what I call engaged empathy, his tears. He cries a lot. And people cry with him. And what's that all about? And that's what that chapter focuses on, engaged empathy, because it's not just the emotion in his preaching, it's also taking that emotion, that awareness of suffering, and engaging in doing something about it to alleviate that suffering. Fourth chapter focuses on dialogue, hoshguru. I can say more about that if you want. And then the fifth chapter focuses on the organizational genius. And it reduces, as I see it, to a word, istishara, which translated variously as giving advice, or better translation, probably mutual consultation. And so what Mr. Gulen does, any initiative, he says, that Muslims undertake should be undertaken through istishara. That is, people sit down and debate with one another the benefits and risks of an enterprise. And it seems to me, if you want to understand the DNA that led to this dramatic growth of this movement around the globe, it's that practice. In other words, that people sit down with each other and really talk. And learn then, through those difficult conversations, to trust each other. Right? And if you want analogies to sort of understand how that works, Protestant revivalists in the United States, someone like Charles Grandison Finney, did something very similar that has really brought people together to trust. And even more, the Society of Friends, the Quakers, their way of doing things is based on deliberation. It's incredibly inefficient, and yet it builds remarkably strong bonds of trust. And it seems to me that's the pattern that I've seen all over the globe is that people get together and practice istishara with each other. Mr. Gülen says istishara is important for Muslims as the practice of prayer, which is extraordinary. And so that's short answer. Chapter 5 in the book is the long answer.
Okay, we have a question.
So someone asked, how does Gülen consider a non-Muslim in Islamic law?
As a sister or brother? Yeah. How does he consider a non-Muslim in Islamic law? Let me preface it by saying I'm not a scholar of Islamic law, and I didn't go in to write a treatise on Mr. Gülen's understanding of jurisprudence. But Mr. Gülen has clearly sought dialogue. It's been one of the central initiatives in his life and work from the very beginning, especially with Jews and Christians, with people of the book. So, and the principle here, I mentioned it earlier, is a term, hoshguru, which usually gets translated as tolerance. So this book that I mentioned, that I heard in 2006, Toward a Global Civilization of Love and Tolerance, is really Toward a Global Civilization of Love and Hoshguru. And hoshguru, tolerance is a weak translation for it. A better way to understand it, it's a compound term that means to see nicely. So at one level, Mr. Gülen would say, Muslims are to practice hoshguru, that is to see nicely others. But Scott Alexander, who's a professor at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, helped me understand this concept of hoshguru a little more robustly and theologically. And he said, really what this means, this impetus for dialogue, this impetus to sit down and talk with each other and work with Jews and Christians and atheists and, anyone on matters that we can work together on. This principle of hoshguru means to see others as God sees them, which means to see others with eyes of mercy and compassion, because that is the characteristic nature of God. So it seems to me, for Mr. Gülen, seeing Christians and Jews and anyone through the eyes of hoshguru is the approach that he recommends.
So what I'm hearing is a philosophy of prayer and meditation, engaged empathy, tolerance, conversation, and which one did I miss? Chapter 4?
That's dialogue.
Dialogue. I think that's a pretty important message for all of us. I love that phrase, engaged empathy, and certainly very poetic idea of tolerance. Okay, another question.
What successful strategies has Gülen used to make positive change in the world?
What successful strategies has Gülen used to make positive changes in the world? And I don't know that I would call it a strategy per se. I'm not sure that he's taught strategic thinking. I think what he's done, the genius of what he's done, is that he has encouraged people to be good Muslims. And when people are faithful Muslims, the world changes for the better. I think that's his strategy, if you will, is to really recall people to the authentic practice of Islam, to the practice of this religion that grew incredibly dramatically through the teaching and work of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the companions of the Prophet. And we see the same kind of dynamism, fascinatingly, in Mr. Gülen's life and work. In the span of just a couple decades, right? What began just in this tiny little Izmir and these sohbets, these prayer circles, spread to this global movement. I mean, it's truly extraordinary. And it wasn't because of a business strategy, as I see it. It was because of the spiritual integrity at the core of his life and practice, as I see it, combined with a willingness to engage in robust debate and encourage people to study science. That is, to bring scientific thinking into compatibility with Islam and the practice of Islam. It seems to me that paradox too. It's not a strategy, it's more a matter of principle in Islam.
It sounds like, as I was reading a little bit of background, this idea of bringing the idea of social enterprise into religion, but with an integrity to it. Yeah. Another question?
Some people consider Hizmet as a cult. What is your opinion on that?
Ouch. Yeah. Well, first of all, historians of religion don't use the word cult because it is an inherently pejorative term. It has no boundaries and no content other than to say, I don't like that kind of religion. Right? So a historian of religion, just by definition, will not use the term because it is always used as a term of disapproval and of condemnation. All right, so just to say that right off the bat. What some people, when people are referring to cults, often what they're referring to is some kind of a charismatic movement or a charismatic authority. Does Mr. Gulen have charisma? Yes, certainly he does. But he doesn't want attention focused on him, right? Which is the exact opposite of what charismatic leaders or cult leaders want, right? He has consistently deflected attention, and his life has been a life of simplicity. He owns nothing, right? And in that integrity, it seems to me, again, is the exact opposite of what people refer to by a cult. And so the accusation is one of these slanders that has been generated by the Turkish government with millions of dollars spent in order to justify the kind of human rights violations that have been occurring over the last couple of years in Turkey. He's a Muslim. And unfortunately, the sad thing is, for another Muslim to say this is a cult is to feed into the very Islamophobia that has justified the violence that has traumatized the Middle East over the last several decades.
How long has Mr. Gülen been living in the U.S. and how has that shaped his view of Americans, particularly Christians?
Thank you. That's a good question. He's been in the U.S. since 1999, and he came to the U.S. primarily for health reasons. He had visited here a couple times previously on tours, and had some doctors here who were important to him. There were some immigrants, some Turkish folks who bought land outside the Poconos, or in the Poconos, in the foothills of the Poconos in Saylorsburg, where they held every summer a summer camp. And that site, eventually there were a couple buildings that were put up, and that site became the retreat center where he lives now. Mr. Gülen has developed a deepened and growing appreciation for democracy over the course of his years in the United States. He says quite directly that his experience of seeing democracy at work in the United States has reinforced his commitment to it and his awareness that Turkey has a long way to go in order to be a truly democratic society. Some might say the United States still has a way to go too, right? I mean, there is no perfect such system. But clearly, Mr. Gülen has appreciated the sanctuary that he's been given here in the United States. He's also, however, a critic of American excesses and of American violence. He has been among the first Muslims to write words of sympathy after terrorist attacks and the gun violence that unfortunately is at play in our country. So he's very much aware of American society and is both an advocate for the systems and a critic of its excesses and its problems.
What about Christians? What's his opinion about Christians?
He's all for us. I mean, simply. But no, Mr. Gülen is a faithful Muslim, and because he's a faithful Muslim, he can engage in dialogue. So in the way I describe his attitude is another one of these paradoxes, principled pluralism. In other words, he's not just a pluralist where kind of anything goes, but he's rather a principled pluralist. In other words, because he's a Muslim, he really thinks that, okay, we can share vision with Christians, we can work with Christians and Jews on projects. And it's especially, his dialogue with Christians and Jews that has gotten him into trouble in Turkey and in the Muslim world. Because there are some Muslims who don't appreciate that attitude and have benefited from drawing clear lines between us and them. Mr. Gülen has been remarkably courageous, in fact, in building bridges, which I think also is the future for all of us and the future for people on the grassroots who don't benefit from the political oppositions between one group or another.
I think we have time for 2 more questions, and then we're going to have some, we've got 3 cards. A few cards. We're going to have an opportunity to sign books. I don't know exactly when we have to get out of here, but let's have a couple more questions.
This one says, what inspired you to write about Mr. Gülen's life, and after writing the book, did it change some thoughts in your mind or heart?
Yes. What inspired me, I think I mentioned earlier that, I really see him in the company of other important and significant religious peace builders. And that's a story I really want to tell, how our religions at their best produce more just, peaceful societies. The single most important source of peace building in the 20th and early 21st century is our religious traditions. The single most important source. If you look at where Gandhi drew his inspiration from, if you look at what happened in Poland and the overthrow of communism, like Walesa and others, that was right out of the Catholic churches. Right? If you look at what happened in South Africa with the Kairos theologians getting together, time after time after time, people inspired by faith have changed their societies for the better. And the example I love mentioning, because almost nobody knows who she is, even though she's a Nobel Peace Prize winner, is the Liberian woman Lima Bowie. How many of you have heard of her? Couple, 3, 4, Leymahgbowe. Lima Bowie. Her memoir, Mighty Be Our Powers, How Prayer, Sex, and Sisterhood Changed the Nation at War, is a remarkable read. It's absolutely fascinating. And so I wrote the book because I see Mr. Gülen in the company of people like that, right? Who understand religion as a power, but a power for peace and justice. What was the second part of the question? Again. How's it changed my heart and mind? Yes. Well, again, I said, I hope it has made me a better Christian. And a couple examples of that. In the church that I serve in Green Bay, I've been there for about, going on 2 years, it'll be 2 years in April. One of the things that we've done is started a dyslexia clinic. So instead of a vacation Bible school, we have a dyslexia clinic serving 60 kids who can't read, or who struggle to read, right? Not teaching the spiritual truths, but teaching people the things they need to live, right? Because I think those are also spiritual truths. And it's Mr. Gülen's influence of this sort of led me to understand the importance of this. Second thing that we've done there is we took what had been a Boy Scout room and a youth room. This was moldy and nasty. and turned it into an incubator space. Repurposed this room, got some grants to do this, and the agency that's going to be starting up in there is called the Brain Center of Green Bay. And it exists to promote brain health from birth through the life course. Started up by a group of retired MDs. So, and Mr. Gulen has encouraged, again, the integration of science and spirituality, and this is a key component of brain health. We are understanding is that prayer and other religious practices change our brains to make them more peaceful and more sociable. It's truly remarkable. I mean, Richard Davidson and other neuroscientists around the country are doing functional MRI studies on Buddhist monks and people who pray. And what they're discovering shouldn't be a surprise to anyone who prays. That as we pray, those centers of our brain that are focused on attention and compassion fire and light, whereas the parts of our brain, the lizard brain, responsible for fight, flight, animal responses, calm. Right? So, inspired by Mr. Gulen's integration of science and religion, in my church, we started a dyslexia clinic and this incubator space, the Brain Center of Green Bay.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two. All right.
This one, are you known by the Turkish government and have you received anything from them?
Yes, I suspect I am probably pretty well known by the Turkish government, although I'm happy to say I have received nothing from them by way of pushback at all, which really kind of surprises me a little, because there is a dedicated army of trolls out there funded by the Turkish government in order to generate the vilification campaign against Mr. Gulen. But it's just been crickets about this book. Now, it may be that their English isn't all that great, and so they're waiting for the Turkish translation. Probably not, though. More likely, they don't want to engage with the book because it's based on the evidence. I'm a historian. I know how to read sources and analyze evidence. And I'm ready for that debate with them. So, if anybody out there in the Turkish government is listening, that's true, you never do. I mean, let's have that debate. I went in, I wrote the book knowing the risks that were involved, and I'm not afraid.
And will you be able to listen with engaged empathy? No need to answer. I know the answer to that question already. Yes. All right, one more question.
Do you believe that Mr. Gulen's Hizmet benefits the whole globe?
Yes. And what's exciting is that the government repression in Turkey is forcing people inspired by Mr. Gulen to globalize. That is, to take Hizmet beyond its Turkish roots. And this is a pattern that has been repeated in Mr. Gulen's life. Time after time after time, the government has sought to squash him and to squash Hizmet. And every time, Hizmet grew stronger. Right? It's truly remarkable. Now, I don't have a crystal ball. I can't predict that this is what's going to happen. But what I have seen as I've traveled around the world, I mean, in the last 3 months, 4 months, I've been in Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, Australia, New Zealand, Eastern Canada, Western Canada, West Coast of the U.S., East Coast of the U.S. I mean, it's been grueling and great. I've met so many people of integrity and who are interested. And what I see is that Hizmet is moving beyond its Turkishness and taking root in new, dramatic ways. For instance, in Tanzania, I did a talk similar to this one in Dar es Salaam, meeting, did a book signing, and afterwards they took me to the headquarters of their relief agency, Time to Help it's called, which is located in a little office building and warehouse right on the shores of the Indian Ocean. And they had a dinner for me. This, after my talk, we had a dinner, and we sat out on a patio with the waves of the ocean crashing behind us, and the big long table set up. And this was the board of trustees of Time to Help, this agency associated with Hizmet, inspired by Mr. Gülen to provide relief in disaster situations, flooding and storms and fires and things like that. And there were, we went around the table and introduced ourselves, and there were about 29 people around the table, a big table. And there were 4 people of Turkish descent, 24 Tanzanians, and me. And that's the future of Hizmet, is that global, right, dynamism, taking Hizmet beyond its Turkishness, always in touch with that origin, but now for the world. That's probably a good place to wrap up.
I would like to ask then, turn the question to you. Anyone here changed by what they heard today, or what was something that you heard that shifted or changed something in you?
Lutherans are really suspicious of altar calls, so I'm gonna put my arms like this right now.
Something important that you learned. Yeah.
I think it's globalization of Hizmet. That you addressed the last part there, the fact that it's spreading around the world. In a way, if you could compare the first 3 centuries of Christianity before it became official in the Roman Empire,
right,
it spread with oppression also.
That's exactly right. A similar dynamic.
Okay. All right, well, we'll take a few minutes to sign copies of the book. Oh, we have one more, yes.
Last year in January in Freiburg with my relatives, I was celebrating Life of Hizmet, the Day of 3 Keys.
Yes.
Yes, and then I began to dig deeper what I was celebrating, because, and it was a quite Catholic holiday, devoted, I think what I have just understood after this talk, maybe it could be a book, because you are writing a coming religious peace. Yes. Maybe in this book there will be common points that we have got in all our religions, because the deeper you know your religion, the more you would like to know about others. Yes?
Yes.
Yeah, because
Yes.
Jesus' mother was buried in Ephes, or is it told like this? Yes, in Turkey. And these 3 kings were from somewhere from the Persian side.
From the east, yes.
Yeah, and people in Spain were praying in churches, and then in mosques, and then again in churches. And it was no difference for them.
Yep.
That they were praying in the ship. That's why maybe in English, friendship, relationship, they have got the same suffix at the end. Yeah, maybe in these books, what we have got in common and what we can celebrate together.
Well, thank you. I'm glad that you learned that tonight.
That's excellent. The universal common ground of spiritual traditions that ties us all together, not our differences. Oh yes, one more.
Okay, I consider myself practicing Muslim, and I've been in 70s, when these movements were similar, to me, similar kind of, there was a great hope. Ethiopia, independence of Zimbabwe, I'm from my ethnic background, I'm from Bangladesh, so after World War II, I was my master's. And now I see they become so conservative.
Yeah.
And the socialism is there, so it's not new. His book is I have read. Yeah. I carried Armstrong's book, and
Yep.
Muhammad.
Yep.
And so I see the pattern, but it's not really. I'm just trying to say, now it's globalized. People like you, you see the interesting things. But when they go home or go to Islamic countries, ordinary people.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, and it's good that we address this. So what we're living with right now is a backlash to globalization as I see it. In other words, with the rise of religious nationalism in India, with Modi, in Russia, the resurgence of the Russian Orthodox Church, even to a degree here in the United States, evangelical support for nationalism. But the broader trends on the grassroots, right, point us toward something very different. Globalization is inexorable, and it's necessary because we face the peril of the very planet that we live on. So we really need to work together. And I too sometimes despair because I go to interfaith gatherings, and they're folks who are already the choir, we might say, right? People who are committed, who get it. But I was invited a couple of years ago to the President's Challenge for Interfaith Service, which this was not this president, but the previous president. And it was held in Washington, D.C., and it was college students from 250 different college campuses across the United States committed to interfaith service. And it was extraordinary. These young people, 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, arguing with each other, not watering down their faith, but holding to it and engaging with a vision for how to change the world for better. And I came away from that saying, okay, the kids are all right, and the future is all right if we, that is those of us who are the elders, and I put myself in that category now, definitely, right, also practice our responsibility and speak up. And don't allow this backlash of religious nationalism to prevail.
And that takes us back to the words of the poem. In this turning time, we finally learn to chime and blend, to attune our voices and sing the vision of the great magic we move within. We begin the new habit, getting up glad for 1,000 years of healing. So I hope that may it be so. Thank you all so much for being here. Let's give him a big round of applause.